So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the Psych Life Podcast. And as usual, we always bring some tremendous guests. And today we have Ben Muratovic, and I'm sorry if I put your name there, Ben, from the New School for Social Research. He's a graduate student in philosophy, and it's an honor and a pleasure to have you here today, Ben. How you doing?
All right. Thank you, Juan, for having me on. I appreciate it. You going through the trouble and everything to be on this podcast right now. And I saw that you even had a request that somebody wanted philosophy on your podcast. And you yourself said you studied philosophy when we were getting to know each other. And for me, actually, it was sort of psychology that led me to philosophy. I wasn't a philosophy undergrad and I wasn't a psychology undergrad. But when I was going through my own personal development, therapy and stuff like that, I started reading a lot of psychology books. And one of them was called When Nietzsche Wept. It's by a psychologist by the name of Irvin Yalom. And he's an existential psychologist. And so this was sort of my gateway drug into philosophy.
Man, I can't believe that you remembered um, that the person that requested that on my on the psychology platform, and I appreciate that. And when I saw that, I got excited because I was aware of your existence, even though you probably weren't aware of mine. And I knew I had to get a philosopher here, right? Someone who knew some stuff. So I really appreciate that, man. I really appreciate the support. But Ben, you're an interesting character because philosophers in general, they're deep thinkers, and they always tend to look at the world through a different lens than most.
Right.
And I was excited to bring you on today to talk of a variety of subjects, but you started it off immediately talking about Irvin Yalom. And obviously he's a big existentialist in psychology, which is one of my favorite psychologists because I'm very big on freedom and liberty and people having the right to do what they want to do and move forward and to aspire for their dreams and goals and break out of their boxes. And so, do you mind sharing a little bit of what was it about that book that you just showed that really inspired you to take a deeper look into philosophy?
Right. So one comment, I would say philosophers are a bit of obsessionals. You know, they obsess over things that maybe other people just don't really think about much. You know, why does this look the way it does? Why does that feel the way it does? But for me personally, I mean, for undergrad and actually for my first grad degree, I was actually an economics major. And for me, before then, everything had to be sort of useful and efficient. And then I had my first sort of serious heartbreak in college. And so I needed something a bit more meaningful in my life besides just cold reason. And so when I picked up Yolom's book, which is about love sickness, and it gave me this like inspiration to sort of develop myself even more. That I knew at that point I wasn't done developing myself, and that I needed not just to be very efficient in life, but I needed to also have a passion in life. And so when I think about philosophy, it's like somebody who's like a musician, right? That, you know, it can be something you do on the side. You might have you might have a day job somewhere, but when you go home that later that night or on the weekend or you're meeting up with friends or something, you know what you're going to do together, right? You're going to, in this case, you might philosophize. So that's sort of my approach to philosophy. And I made a vow to myself that I would eventually return back to the classroom so I could learn philosophy.
Oh, and you kept that promise to yourself. And we're gonna dive so deep into some of the stuff you're talking about. And now I'm really glad. I'm more glad than I already was that I invited you on the podcast because philosophy comes from two Greek words, which are love and wisdom.
Right.
And so it's difficult for people to sometimes dive into the subject of philosophy because it's so deep, and the immediate picture I have is when I used to always get A's in college and I used to take like these philosophy classes, these psych classes. And it wasn't until, like I mentioned to you earlier, I had this one teacher. Okay, wait a second. Like, this isn't an easy A. And if you didn't dive into those books and actually understand the theories and go in inside that philosophy of science class, you're going to fail. And there was older people. I remember there was a lady there. She must have been in her mid 40s. And at the time I was 22, you know? So she said, man, I can't do this. I can't do this. I mean, I'm too old for this. And the way he's going in, and she was basically making it seem like if the teacher was a little cuckoo. But to me, it was more the teacher loved what he was doing. And if you were going to take that class, you needed to learn and you needed to reason. So love and wisdom, how does those two words relate to philosophy? Yeah, because that's the Greek definition. But when I think of philosophy, I'm thinking of a way of life that someone reasons. And mistake me if I'm wrong, because obviously I'm 29 now, and it's been a while since I've taken that class. So do you mind sharing the relationship there?
Right. I would say that the key word is wisdom, right? So when we're thinking about what is wisdom, some people might say it's just knowledge, right? And I think there's but a lot of philosophers are very keen to point out that knowledge and truth are not necessarily the same thing, right? Knowledge is true, correct? But truth, as you were alluding to, is sort of like a way of being in this world, right? It's like how you choose to approach sort of facts and reason, and how that combines through your own personal existence, right? And so there's no way to say that, like, we can't just say we're purely objective. I think that's something that philosophers are very keen on, right? We're not just pure scientists, or we're not just pure, like, analyst microscopes or something like that. We are people who have our own biases, we have our own passions, and that's a big part of what makes us go into sort of any field that we choose to study, whether it be a psychology or philosophy and economics, or even being a med student, right?
You know, you mentioned there about our how philosophers don't tend to be so objective oriented. And immediately I wrote down some philosophers and everything. I mean, I came prepared for this interview, Ben. Socrates, right? I mean, let's start off by telling the audience that there's thousands of philosophers, Eastern and Western, all over the globe, philosophers that made a huge difference and contributions to their societies that we don't even know their names, because there's history has been destroyed over time. Sometimes things happen. And so immediately I mentioned Socrates, and it's like the cover for philosophers sometimes, right? Because it's the most famous word. Everybody talks about Socrates and stuff. But I'm going to start off with him because that was the first philosopher I learned about, which he's mentioned how all our behaviors are put into use because for the pursuit of happiness, because we want happiness. And then there came other philosophers from that type of society and culture that he was from, that said similar things, but they always had their own way of reasoning and viewing things. And so I just want to see what's your opinion about philosophers from that group of time. And the immediate first three, I think, because they came almost right after the other, was Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. So what is your thoughts on these three philosophers in specific?
So we don't actually have anything written by Socrates himself, right? So all we have of Socrates is sort of secondhand sources. We have Plato's dialogues, and we have sort of the other. And Plato was obviously Socrates' student, or at least he alludes to. And we have other writers who are actually very critical of Socrates at the time. We have, we had a bunch of Greek poets at the time or thinkers and politicians who actually thought Socrates was sort of crazy. And so Socrates is actually a really mysterious figure. I just studied Jacques Lacan. He's a psychoanalyst from France from the middle of the 20th century. And he said the longest transference or the greatest transference in human history was Socrates, because we project so much stuff onto Socrates because we don't actually know. When we read Plato's dialogues, are we reading the real Socrates beliefs, or are we reading Plato's interjection onto Socrates? And and this is sort of a big, and that leads into Plato, right? And so Plato is then using Socrates to say his own school of thought, because he finds the ancient Greek Athenian academy, and he's interested in doing a specific type of philosophy. And then we get Aristotle, who is then a student of Plato and from the academy. And then you have Aristotle disagreeing on Plato that, the focus should be more scientific rather than more focused on the sort of quote unquote ideas that Plato had about, what is truth, right? So, there's the famous painting where Plato is pointing to the sky and Aristotle's pointing to the ground, and you see having a dispute. And then there's all these other thinkers around them of that time who are disputing, like, how should we do philosophy?
There was and this was a while back, I'm sure there was even some debate whether Socrates was a real figure.
Right.
But this is obviously, there's other writers that talk about Socrates, so
Right.
we pretty much know that he was a real figure. But when you say there's no writings about him, it creates this big mystery around him,
Right.
because everything is secondhand, like you said, and it's interesting when you look at it from that lens. So immediately, a lot of times in these schools, whether it doesn't matter around the U.S., I can only speak because that's where I've gotten a good portion of my education. They always bring up almost the same philosophers over and over, right? They
Right.
bring up Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, and these are the main three. These are like, they put them as the godfathers. But it wasn't until I started taking trips to Asia, to Europe, and I started opening my mind up more to these books, and especially to the Dalai Lama, which he was like a gateway for me into a different realm of philosophers like Confucius, like Buddha, and these are interesting characters. Now, why is it that the school systems, right, they focus so much on these westernized philosophers, and they leave out the ones that have what I consider, this is personal, of course, there's no fact, what I
Right.
consider a little bit more of a spiritual or element to it. Why do you think that is, Ben? And I'm sorry for these tough questions, man.
No.
These were some real questions that came up.
Well, I think there's actually a sort of, I don't think if you would have asked Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, were they Western, right? They weren't Western, right? They felt they had much more in common with East, Persia, and sort of the Eastern empires, more so than they felt more closer to, say, the people who were existing in what we call modern day Germany, England, and stuff like that. Um, so I think around the time when we have like the ideas like the Enlightenment, right? So the idea that around the 1700s, that men are created equal, that we need a democracy or a republic of some type. You have people who want to go back to ancient Greece, pull these ideas and say, this is what we're based on, right? And at the same time, there's a big concern about trying to get away from religion as well, because in sort of Europe at that time, there is this sort of, there's all these wars going on. There's all these religious wars. And so they when they would try to make sort of the quote unquote Western canon of philosophy, at the time they were trying to really say that philosophy sort of how it adds into like the political philosophy in a way. And so, and of course, this is sort of more controversial because, if you read a Socrates and a Plato, right? Socrates is constantly talking about a spiritual. He's talking about like a spiritual daemon inside of him that's telling him that he just has to pursue wisdom wherever he goes. And this is not like it's not something he can explain necessarily. He gives it in his apology
Mm.
that in front of the Athenian Senate that he needs to follow the truth wherever it leads to.
You man, you brought up some good stuff, and I appreciate you clearing that up. By the way, I appreciate you clearing that up. And I realized as you were talking, I was like, "Holy cow! It's me who's putting them in the westernized box. It's me." And so I appreciate you
It's
debunking my
not it's not
reality.
just you. I think it's a lot of people. Um, I think one example is just like, when we think of the ancient Greeks and their statues, we think of them as being like clean and white, but they were actually very colorful. The statues were not actually, and the temples were not actually white. They don't look like the White House. Actually, they actually were very colorful. They actually resembled more like Aztec temples, and they actually did a modern day sort of American ideas of a museum or something like that.
Hey, I appreciate you clearing that up. You mentioned earlier, right in the beginning of the podcast, as soon as I mentioned the Greek term, how the word wisdom is used, and sometimes that gets confused with knowledge because knowledge is facts, right? That's I learned that by my philosophy class that it's the accumulation of facts that is the basis of science in today's world. They've had other philosophers saying what science was, but it ultimately came back to the accumulation of facts. But wisdom is the Greek word behind the word philosophy, and wisdom is the application. And so the application of the philosophy, this reasoning. Okay, so you mentioned religion, and I'm once again I'm glad you brought that up, because is religion, and this isn't against any religion or nothing like that, but just a conversation. Religion, is that not a philosophy by its term?
Yeah, I would say it is a philosophy. I had a philosophy professor who once told me um, philosophy is supposed to be, at least traditionally, it was supposed to be taught, so then you can do theology, right? And so there's actually, you know, so there's no way to actually necessarily to divorce the two, because when you believe in philosophy, you kind of do have an ontological, big cosmology sort of view of the world, right? So whether you be an atheist or a theist, you have some core metaphysical beliefs of the world, right? And you can't necessarily prove them, in sort of a reductive faction, that people hope to do, but you can't separate the two as some people would like necessarily to do. Also, my favorite philosopher or sort of the gateway was Friedrich Nietzsche, and he said all philosophers are sort of self-autobiographical when they write. They're talking about themselves when they really write their own philosophy. They can't escape the prison of themselves.
That and Oh, I appreciate you clearing that up, but you can't escape the prison of yourself, and that goes with what I was thinking earlier. I just want to be careful with my words. When someone is living, okay, so we all have personal philosophies. I have some. My grandparents have some. My girlfriend has some. The little Joey across the street has his own philosophy, even though he's a kid. And it's not like when we're living these philosophies that we've created about ourselves, this big umbrella where everything we do falls into this umbrella. It's sometimes we don't even realize that we have these philosophies. Uh, we think of philosophy as this big umbrella term, and this is what we're living. Do you consider it an issue, right? When we create an umbrella for ourselves, we're living a certain philosophy based on whatever reason, our experiences, and then all of a sudden everything falls under there. And even when we're wrong, we use that philosophy as an excuse. And this is a perfect example of religion, right? Because I have my own
Right.
personal philosophies, but what happens when there's a philosophy so big that that all our behaviors coordinate with it, and when we do wrong, we justify it because of the bigger philosophy, and ways that cannot be measured, like, oh, I did this because of my philosophy in the book that I'm following, and God wrote is a descendant, like this book is a descendant from God or whatever, and then it justifies it. How does philosophy today try and tackle these issues or present awareness about them?
I would say that it's, I don't have a problem with the term people using personal philosophies. I'm not an elitist who thinks that like only the people in the grad school or something like that, they only the ones that understand philosophy or something like that. Um, I think the big idea though of philosophy, and this goes back to what we were talking about, like Plato and Socrates, is they're written as a dialogue. You know, they're written as a conversation between people, and so in a way, in my view, and a lot of different philosophers that I study with, you know, true philosophy is sort of communicating with people like we are doing right now, right? We're having a sort of you know, a conversation, and you know, sometimes that can be, you know, with certain people that can be like a contest as well, but then there's also the dialogue that goes on between two people, and we are like trying to narrow what we're talking about so in one way we can relate. And so I think that's where, for example, where psychology has that overlap, right? You know, you do therapy, and and you're meeting this person, right? And you're meeting the therapist, and the therapist is meeting the patient or the client or some and type, and they're having a conversation about what works for them, or what's going on in their life, and so, and then they're trying to figure out what actually makes you feel good, what makes you feel like sort of a pursuit of happiness, like you mentioned, what helps you get to that level.
Oh, so you when and I'm just sorry, I just want to clarify when I said personal philosophies, uh, you immediately said that you're not an elitist, and I appreciate that, by the way. That but you don't consider personal philosophies, um, pro philosophies in general. Is that? I'm sorry, I didn't understand that part.
So I don't think, I think philosophy is more of a process, right? So it's a more of a way. So everybody does have their own personal philosophy in a sense, and how we see that it really operates and how that works out is like our interactions with other people, right? So if we're able to have good conversation, right, or a fun conversation, or even a, you know, an emotionally helpful conversation, you know, like you mentioned, like having a romantic partner of some type, right? That's an example of engaging in philosophy.
Okay, gotcha,
Right.
gotcha, and I appreciate that. So, now we're gonna get a little bit more open ended here,
Right.
and um, you mentioned that your favorite philosopher's name was Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm sorry, I
Nietzsche.
did Nietzsche,
Yeah.
and my favorite philosopher growing up was Thomas Paine, and
Right.
Thomas Paine obviously was my favorite philosopher because he always, just much like Irvin Yalom, he understood the importance of freedom and the pursuit. Although Irvin Yalom always talks about the pursuit of your dreams, Thomas Paine was a little bit more fundamental than that, in that first, before you can pursue anything, you have to be free. And he was very big on a person's freedom, that very limited government, which was very popular around the time that he was alive for obvious reasons. Uh, I feel like sometimes these philosophers, they get thrown a back seat when they have a lot to give, and just because the society views them just talkers or deep thinkers, or they throw them away. And you see people that study philosophy, then a lot of times this is a new pattern I'm seeing, where they'll study philosophy and then they'll go into political science, or they'll be a lawyer off that philosophy degree. And I feel like philosophers in general have a lot to give. I mean, just in this podcast in general, you're providing some deep insight that I wasn't expecting on philosophy itself. Um, Thomas Paine, what are your opinions about his philosophy in everyone having the freedom and the liberty to do what they want and what they do? And some people even associate him with what's that term called? Anarchy.
Well, Thomas Paine, the thing is though he wasn't even popular among his like fellow founding fathers, right? He was exiled by them. All right. He was told to he was told to go to revolutionary France, and Thomas Jefferson apparently had to come and save him and bring him back to the States. And nobody wanted to attend his funeral either, right? So like he was actually, in a way, he was sort of like a true philosopher, like
He was outcasted,
right. So,
right? Like any
like all
great philosopher.
right. Even Nietzsche, my favorite philosopher, he wasn't actually a philosophy professor, right? He was actually a philologist, so he studied language, and his contemporaries thought his writings were too philosophical. They weren't, they weren't enough to be sort of academic. So he left colleges, he left everything, and he lived in sort of poverty for a long time for the rest of his life, traveling around Europe, and writing his philosophy. So in a way, when philosophy, if you take it as a sort of passion, a lot of the philosophers ended up being exiled in some way or viewed as radical because they pose some complicated questions. So,
Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt there, Ben. I'm sorry.
so like anyway, I mean, like I was just going to say that Thomas Paine, he was such a radical believer in sort of a meritocracy. So everybody, you get what you earn, right? He thought that there should be 100% inheritance tax. Nobody should inherit anything, and then you should work really hard, and then you could prove yourself once from day one, right? Nobody has a leg up, and I think that legacy is still around, and I think Thomas Paine actually does a good job compared to some of his fellow founding fathers to measure up to sort of today's philosophers.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I like how you said Thomas Jefferson had to rescue him from France. And Thomas Jefferson had great relationships with the French, and the fact that he had to rescue Thomas Paine. But I kind of related to him a lot growing up. And I just learned something new, man. I didn't know people didn't attend his funeral, but why should I have even doubted that? I mean, if he was, that's a sign that he was a good philosopher, in my opinion. But so moving forward on this podcast, I told you I wanted to bring up the topic. My professor, right? Not the ones that took philosophy soft, though. Dr. Hood, and I'll give him credit because he was good. He taught at UWF, University of West Florida. I consider him a philosopher in his own right. And he always talked about how psychology, he felt like the field came up super short. And he used the example on how there was once a philosopher, or he said the story where there was a philosopher whose roommate was studying psychoanalytics, and the philosopher, of course, kept presenting questions. He kept saying, but what about this? What happened if the child has this? But what happens if this had this? What does that mean? And the psychoanalyst always had an answer for every question. Always. It never doubted it. Oh, that's because this and this, and he had no proof in saying it. So that's where Dr. Hood always said that's where psychology came up short, that sometimes it's hard to prove this, and to prove, like, how can you prove psychoanalytics? How can you prove some of the theories that are made in psychology? And I have to be honest, at the time, he made me think a lot, because at that moment, that was my senior year of college, and I started looking at things through, can it be proven through the scientific method? And as we both know, psychology has had a difficult time replicating studies. This is not a secret. And I find that fascinating, because the reason why it's tough to replicate studies is because every single human being on this planet is wired based on their genetic component and based on their experiences. And so there's always thousands of unforeseen variables that are happening just by the way the person's processing information that cannot be seen based on experiences. And that's where psychology has come up short. But now there's been an uptake in neuroscience, and that's given us a scientific component and element in psychology. And the purpose of neuroscience is to provide research and facts, or knowledge, or the accumulation of facts, to be used in practical application for people's own mental health, well-being, and whatnot. So, Ben, I'm going to always direct the
Right.
question back to you. What's your opinion on that component there involving psychology? Because there's a lot of philosophers who have issue with psychology, not because of its intention, but because of some of the things I mentioned, the lack being unfalsifiable, especially
Right.
now, especially in psychoanalytics that it's older, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So, I would say that um, it's not just psychology. Philosophers are always bashing each other too. So I think most famous for attacking psychoanalysis was Karl Popper, who's Occam's razor, saying that like it's unfalsifiable, like you were mentioning. Uh, they will say the same thing about other philosophers that like if human being is a historical animal, how can you prove that human beings are then sort of you can prove how a human being is going to develop and stuff like that, and they will attack that too. So it's not just psychology being bullied by the philosophers. The philosophers are bullying each other because but to narrow it down to psychology, it's just that I would say that yes, like you said, that there's so many different variables, right? But I would say that psychology at its core is it it's not necessarily going to get like a default outcome for everybody. Not everybody's going to get therapy and it's going to sort of they're all going to end up the same, right? We have sort of mechanisms in our society to say like, oh, this therapist doesn't work, you go to this therapy, right? Or you work with this therapist, right? And so I think this goes back to what I was mentioning before, that it's like this relationships. It's like what is the goal of you having a sort of relationship with this psychologist, is this therapist in a way, like, and I think that's never going to be, in my opinion, an objective science, in the sense that, but in the same way that having a personal philosophy is never going to be an objective science either, because there's this human element, and I think a lot of philosophers recognize this too, that if you read an Immanuel Kant, who's like talking about we never really have access to the thing in itself. All we have access is to representations, right? And it's the same, and you will see a lot of philosophers build off that. Nietzsche himself, he's saying that like we don't actually have access to things in itself. What we have access is to what our human input on how we view things and our perspective. And so it's very difficult to hope that human beings are going to operate sort of like machines or like mechanics, that like, you put in this equation, um, and that's it. And I would say that a lot of fields have quote unquote physics envy, instead of penis envy, they have physics envy, because they're just obsessed with saying like, oh, my field is a science. And it's very difficult because human beings have one shot at existence and we can't go back and change things. Oh, okay, for you, Juan, let's put you in a different family. We can't replicate that, right? We can't just let's put me in a different situation and see if I end up the same. It's very difficult to sort of replicate that experience.
And I'm glad that you brought some light to that, on how philosophers are always debunking each other.
Right.
But it's true. It's true. I in my field, despite the intentions, I've realized, because obviously you go to 4 years to get a psychology degree, you engage yourself in social sciences, then all of a sudden you get your graduate level degree, and you begin work, you go through the internship, then you begin working with clients in the field, and you start working towards licensure. And I realized exactly what you said, which is, it doesn't matter how many theories I know, it doesn't matter how many books I read on CBT, reality therapy, Gestalt, even Freud, and research on neuroscience, which is what I've been reading more over the last 3 years, instead of just pure because I said so type of books. Everything stems from the relationship I build with my client. If the
Mm-hmm.
relationship's crappy,
Right.
meaning they can't trust me, they're scared that if I tell them something, I'm going to tell their parents, or if I don't build that trust where they can trust me when I say, you need to tell your parents about this, without threatening them that I'm going to tell them if they, the relationship I built with them and how I carry myself and the figure that I am in their mind as a facilitator for change. That is the biggest factor in therapy that I have found. That's even more important than the theories themselves. And I know sometimes people, they don't want to hear that, because in philosophy, because it's they discuss science a lot. Science, you can control variables. This variable and this variable together equate to this, or all these variables together, they form this, and this is the chances. That doesn't exist in psychology, even though they've tried so hard and they continue to try, because the experiences I've had are influencing me right now in this conversation, word for word, in ways that I don't even understand and I can't comprehend. And I'm not mindful about it because they cloak themselves from us. And so I'm very glad that you brought some light to that and you were very honest. And I'm hoping that, philosophers included, they continue to talk about this, because the whole purpose of psychology as a field is so it can be used in practical purposes, just like philosophy. And I think the field, even though it's done well and it's come up short in a lot of ways, and the fact that they've tried turning it into a causational approach, I think it's a recipe for disaster. And that's what the field, honestly, that's what the field as an insider is facing right now. That you have people thinking that because they see a therapist, because they see a psychologist, this is going to turn out well, when it's more factors than that. But we want to think it as an absolute. So I appreciate you, man, being super honest about that conversation. With philosophers in general, what is the goal purpose when someone goes into this field of philosophy? Because what I mentioned earlier, I see people sometimes study philosophy, but that's so it could help them in a political setting, so they can apply that aspect of deep reasoning for society. So what's the typical aspiration for someone studying philosophy, Ben?
I think, I mean, philosophy, people think, oh, you just want to become a professor, or maybe you want to go to law school or something like that. And I think those are legitimate, right? I think philosophy is sort of the thing that allows us to get deeper into, other specialties, so philosophy in a way is sort of like the original mode of education in a way. And then all these other specializations that we have today, so law school or, med school or something, is in a way a specialization of what philosophy attempts to do in a broad sense, right? And I don't think, when I was studying, for example, economics, I did math, but I didn't really like math, which was, sort of like, I didn't find it as interesting as maybe I should, right? And then it's actually only going to philosophy do I then want to go back and pick up some of my economics books and try to understand the math again, because it's like, what about this math, for example, do I find is so difficult? What is it about? What is it trying to prove, right? What is the value of this math equation, right? And you will see that philosophers are not just interested in necessarily politics, even though they do have political leanings of their own, of course, but they are interested in, what we're talking about, for example, philosophy of science, right? The New School for Social Research in the philosophy program, there's actually a psychoanalysis minor, because a lot of the philosophers go on to like a psychoanalytic institute and they want to become analysts. And in New York State, all you need is a master's degree to become a psychoanalyst or any sort of health professional, mental health professional, and you just needed an institute then to sort of verify that.
But I appreciate you clearing that up, Ben.
Right.
Well, Ben, I got through all the questions,
Right.
and I guess I'll just ask you some personal ones.
Right.
Are you going to be a politician?
Oh, no, So when I was an undergrad, I was actually a double major in economics and political science. And um, I think philosophy sort of screwed up any sense of like, oh, I can go out and be a politician. One of my best friends is trying to be a politician. He's running for office right now. And I couldn't do what he does. For me, um, there's a point where I feel like I'm too honest in a way to be a politician, right? I can't get around the authenticity or inauthenticity problem that that's required to be a sort of see, that was a Freudian slip. I said psychologist, but I meant politician. I think that it's very difficult to see myself sort of just telling people maybe what they want to hear, or being vague enough, and then they get disappointed when I try to make them promises that I can't possibly fulfill. And it's very difficult for anybody, I think, to be in that role, because people will become angry at you.
Well, you sound like a nice guy because you don't want to make promises you can't keep, honestly. I
Right.
guess we'll finish the interview with by me asking you a question, because I forgot you mentioned the word can't a couple times, Kant. So just so
Uh,
everybody out there,
right.
the audience understands, that's a philosopher's name. That is the name of the philosopher that coined the term social constructs.
Um, I don't think he necessarily coined the term social constructs. He was actually a big fan of Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a one of the three famous social contract idealists. And Kant was a big fan of Rousseau, and Rousseau was talking about how sort of social constructs really shaped human development or human history in a way.
Would you say that all of us are living social constructs that go beyond our awareness?
Oh yeah, yeah, because we can't necessarily, sort of our institutions or our social constructs, they are like historically embedded, and we are not necessarily always aware about what we might know implicitly, what comes with those institutions. Um, so a famous philosopher today by the name of Slavoj Žižek, um, he's known for being a sort of troll in his way. He's humorous and he has a thick Eastern European accent. He says that they're the unknown knowns, right? So there are things that we know, but we don't actually know that we know them. And I think this is where um, sort of ideas of psychology actually come into play, like this idea of the unconscious, things that we pick up as children that we just don't even pay attention to. Mom and dad act this way, um, so I act the same way with my own partner, and we're not ever really sure about them until we actually are forced to look at them. Um, so there are things we know, but we don't know that we know them, and I think that's where social constructs are.
And that's and that, my friend, there, Ben, you hit it right on the nail. That's where the field is going,
Right.
and bringing all that unknown to realization. Because you mentioned, oh, I modeled my parents, and now I'm practicing some of the ways that they were practicing in their relationship with the person you're dating or whatnot, and you don't even realize that you're doing that. You
Right.
think that you at the moment you think this is what it is, and to break out of that paradigm or that construct, is essential for growth. And sometimes people don't want that bubble to be burst, though,
Right.
and it all depends on how a person goes about it. But I don't know if this is philosophical or not at this point, man. You got my head spinning, which is
Right.
good because that means I learned something. I was thinking,
Well,
uh,
I would say
uh,
that the biggest challenge to your life is your romantic partner. I think I get into arguments with my girlfriend, and we're always like, "Why do you do this?" or "Why do I do that?" And it's just like, and it's like, "Oh, wait, we both thought we had to live a certain way, and then suddenly it's like, well, you don't have to do this. Like you can be aware of why we do things. So sometimes she doesn't trust me to be in the kitchen alone because it's just like you're gonna make a mess and you're gonna leave the cupboards open, and then sometimes I'm like frustrated at her, and I'm just like, you know what, it's not, like I should be careful how I sound, because sometimes I sound like I'm talking down because I'm this philosopher and I think I know things, and but as Socrates said, the only thing you know is I don't know things actually.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was actually cracking up there because I would just bring up Thomas Paine. That's what I do. I have the
Right,
liberty to be in the kitchen.
right.
And I'm kidding. And I'm kidding about that, man.
Right.
But you really, hey Ben, I want to let everybody know, thank you. And on behalf of the audience, thank you. I hope the audience out there, all you psych lifers, you guys enjoyed this podcast because this is a first for us. We've never brought in a philosopher. I mean, we've brought in shamans, we've brought in psychiatrists, therapists, social workers, authors, actors, famous public athletes, but we've never brought a philosopher, Ben. You're the first one. And I appreciate you, my friend, so much. You brought a lot of insight. You clarified the definition of philosophy. You clarified some of the beliefs that I had, and I appreciate you deconstructing them as far as how my mind just naturally separates Western and Eastern philosophers when really they were just practicing philosophy. You clarified social constructs, the unconscious, and you also clarified the role of philosopher, those that study philosophy are aspiring to be, and how we all have personal philosophies in our life
Right.
that we practice that is not in our awareness, which ties directly to psychology. And actually, the main thing I've been trying to preach on this page, which is that the main reason why we do things actually cloak themselves from us, despite us fully believing that we know why we're doing things. And so, man, I really appreciate you, man. And you gave some tremendous insight. And do you want to share any last words?
No, I mean, I appreciate. I hope that people find this somewhat insightful. I don't think. I think. I think you could study philosophy on your own. Just remember that to have those conversations with other people about it. Don't just get caught up of being by yourself and reading the book. Read the book and then talk to somebody about it. I think that's important. You don't have to necessarily pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a philosophy degree. And make goals for yourself. Like if you're going to read a book about philosophy, try to see it through, because it's very dense stuff, and like you said, that you have to read it through sometimes, and it's a headache or two, but there's a payoff. Even as long as I've been studying philosophy, I don't understand a class until the last week of the class, and then the light bulb hits, and I'm like, this makes sense finally. I can reread it now, and it will all be put together. So it's a struggle.
I appreciate those last words. And what class isn't like that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
but,
I'm
but
kidding, bro.
I think philosophers, they try difficult to be difficult. They want to give you a headache, I think, more so than any other field, in my opinion.
Well, you didn't give a headache here today, man. If
Okay.
anything, it's actually backwards. I appreciate you, Ben. And thanks to everybody listening out there, to all your psych lifers. And stay tuned for the self-reflection journal coming out on July 2nd, I believe. All right, guys, take care.
Thank you, Juan.
And psych life. Pause.